Chapter 2. A Servant Finds Out. When I arrived the next day, Holmes was not there. So I waited in his room. At 4 o'clock the door opened, and a very strange servant came in. He wore old, dirty clothes, and I had to look very hard before I saw that it was my old friend. "Holmes!" I cried. "Where have you been?" "I've had a very good day," he replied with a smile. "I've been outside Miss Irene Adler's house. Servants are always happy to talk, and so I have heard a lot about the young woman. For example, she has a good-looking man friend called Godfrey Norton, a lawyer who often visits her. Now, why? If he's her lawyer, perhaps she's already given him the photograph. But if he loves her, she won't show him the photograph." "Most interesting, Holmes," I said. While I was there, Mr. Norton himself suddenly arrived. I watched them through the windows. When he left, he jumped into a taxi. "To the Church of St. Monica, as fast as you can," he shouted. 2 minutes later, Miss Adler ran out of her house, jumped into another taxi, and called, "To the Church of St. Monica, quickly." I couldn't miss this, Watson, so I jumped into a third taxi. When I arrived, I went into the church. Godfrey Norton looked round and saw me. "Thank God!" he shouted. "Come here quickly." "Why?" I asked. "Come on, man, we need you." And so I helped Godfrey Norton to marry Irene Adler. They needed a witness, and a servant from the street was better than nobody. "So, she's married him. What shall we do now?" I asked. "Well, tonight, my dear Watson, I need your help. Will you do what I ask? Without questions?" "Of course, Holmes, if you think that it's important," I answered. Later, we'll go to Briony Lodge. Irene Adler, or Irene Norton, will arrive home at 7 o'clock, and she will ask me to go into the house. You must wait outside near the sitting-room window, and when it opens, watch me inside. When I hold up my hand, throw this thing into the room and shout, 'Fire!'" I took the small thing out of his hand. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. "It's a smoke stick. The room will very quickly be full of smoke. After that, wait for me at the corner of the street." "Right. I'll do what you want," I said. Chapter 3. Fire. That evening Holmes again wore different clothes, and a large black hat. But it was not just the clothes that were different. He changed his face, his hair, everything. He was a different man. We walked together to Serpentine Avenue. Outside the house there were a lot of people who were smoking, laughing, and talking. Holmes and I walked up and down in front of the house. "You see," said Holmes to me, "I think she doesn't want her new husband to see the photograph." "But where is it?" "At her bank?" "No, women like to keep important things themselves." "I'm sure it's in her house." "But the king's men tried to find it," I said. "Yes, but they didn't know where to look," said Holmes. "But how will you know?" I asked. "I won't look. She'll show me." "She'll have to." Just then a taxi arrived. One of the men in the street ran to open the door. Then another man pushed him. Other men were also pushing and shouting, and a fight began. Irene Norton was in the middle of it. But Sherlock Holmes ran to help her. Then suddenly he fell to the ground, with blood running down his face. Irene Norton hurried to her front door, but she looked back. "How kind of him to help me! Is the poor man hurt?" she called. "He's dead," cried some voices. "No, he's only hurt," cried others. "Bring him into the sitting room," she said. Some people carried Holmes into the house. I waited outside the window and watched. I saw how beautiful Irene Norton was. Then Holmes put up his hand, and I threw the smoke-stick into the room. Immediately the people in the street and in the house all began to shout fire very loudly. The house was full of smoke. I walked away, and 10 minutes later Holmes came to meet me. "Well done, Watson," he said. "Have you got the photograph?" I asked. "I know where it is." "She showed me," he answered. "But why did she show you?" "It's easy," he said, and laughed. "You saw all those people in the street? I paid them to help us. It wasn't a real fight, and the blood wasn't real. When people shout fire, a woman runs to the most important thing in her house, her baby, her gold, or a photograph. Mrs. Norton ran to find her photograph, which is in a cupboard in the sitting room. I saw it, but I did not take it. Tomorrow we will go to her house with the king. We'll go very early before she gets up. The king himself can take the photograph from the cupboard, and then we'll go." While Holmes was talking, we were walking home to Baker Street. When we arrived at my friend's house, a young man hurried past us and said, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "I've heard that voice before," said Holmes to me. He looked down the street. But who was it? Chapter 4. A Photograph. The next day we went to Irene Norton's house with the king. An old servant opened the door. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, and smiled. "Yes," said my friend. He looked very surprised. "Mrs. Irene Norton and her husband left England this morning. They will never come back to this country." "What?" cried Holmes, his face white and angry. "And what about the photograph?" cried the king. We all hurried into the sitting room. Holmes ran to the cupboard and opened it. Inside was a photograph, not of Irene Adler and the king, but of the beautiful Irene alone. There was also a letter for Sherlock Holmes. We all read it together. "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you did it very well. I thought that it was a real fire, and that you were just a kind old man. But after I opened the cupboard, I began to think. I knew about the famous Sherlock Holmes. I knew your address, and I knew that the king asked you to find the photograph. So I quickly dressed as a young man and followed you home to Baker Street. I wanted to find out if you really were Sherlock Holmes. I said good night to you outside your door. My husband and I have decided to leave England. Please tell the king that I shall not show the photograph to anybody. I love my husband, and he loves me, and he is a better man than the king. But here is a different photograph, and the king can keep this photograph if he likes. Irene Norton.
"What a woman!" cried the king. "Why didn't I marry her? What a woman!"
"A very, very clever woman," said Sherlock Holmes coldly. "I am sorry, Your Majesty, that this business has not finished well."
"No, no," said the king. "She writes that she will never show the photograph to anybody. I need nothing more than her word. There is no danger for me now. How can I thank you, dear Mr. Holmes?"
"I would like just one thing, Your Majesty."
"Tell me at once what it is," said the king.
"This photograph." The king looked at him in surprise.
"Irene's photograph?" he cried. "But of course, it is yours."
And so there was no terrible scandal in the royal families of Europe, and Sherlock Holmes still has the photograph of the woman who was cleverer than he was. The 5 Orange Pips. Chapter 1. The Story of Uncle Elias. In September 1887, my wife was visiting some of her family. So I was staying with my old friend, Sherlock Holmes, in Baker Street. It was a windy, stormy evening, and the rain was falling heavily outside. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I looked at my friend in surprise. "Who can this be?" I asked. "If he comes on business in this weather, it's important," said Sherlock Holmes. "Come in," he called. A young man came in. He looked wet, tired, and worried. "I've come to ask for help," he said. "I've heard of you, Mr. Holmes. People say you know everything. I don't know what to do." "Well, sit down," said Holmes, "and tell me about yourself." The young man sat down and put his wet feet near the fire. "My name is John Openshaw. My father, Joseph, had a brother, my uncle Elias, who went to live in America when he was young. He made a lot of money there. He didn't like the black Americans, so during the Civil War he fought against the men from the North and with those from the South. But when the South lost the war and there was equality for black people, Uncle Elias left America. So in 1869 he came back to England and went to live in a large house in the country. He was a strange, unhappy man. He did not want any friends, John Openshaw went on, and he often drank a lot. But he liked me, and when I was 12, I moved to Uncle Elias's house. He was very kind to me. I could go anywhere in the house. But there was one small room at the top of the house which was always locked. Nobody could go into this room. One day, Uncle Elias got a letter from Pondicherry, in India. "I don't know anyone in Pondicherry," he said. But when he opened the envelope, 5 little orange pips fell onto his plate. I began to laugh, but stopped when I saw my uncle's white face. "K, K, K," he cried. "Oh, my God, they've found me." "What do you mean, Uncle?" I asked. "Death," he cried, and ran upstairs. I looked at the envelope, which had 3 Ks on the back. There was no letter. Who sent it? And why was my uncle so afraid? Uncle Elias went immediately to the secret room and took out a box which also had 3 Ks on it. He burnt all the papers in the box and said to me, "John, I know that I'm going to die soon. My brother, your father, will have all my money and my house after my death, and you will have it all when he dies. I hope you can enjoy it, but if not, give it to your worst enemy. I'm afraid that my money brings death with it." I didn't understand what he meant, and nothing happened for a few weeks, so I did not feel so worried. But my uncle was very afraid. He stayed in his room most of the time, and drank more than before. He always locked all the doors carefully. Then one night he drank very heavily, and ran wildly out of the house. And in the morning we found him dead in a river. The police said he killed himself, but I knew he was afraid to die, so I didn't think that was true.
Holmes stopped the young man for a minute. "Tell me," he said, "when did your uncle get the letter from India? And when did he die?"
The letter arrived on the 10th of March, 1883, and he died 7 weeks later,
answered John Openshaw. "Thank you. Please go on," said Holmes.
After my uncle's death, my father moved into the house. Of course, I asked him to look carefully at the locked room, but we didn't find anything important.
Chapter 2. More Pips.
"Everything went well until a year later,"
said John Openshaw.
"But one morning my father opened a letter to find 5 orange pips inside it. 'What does this mean, John?' he asked. His face was white. 'Look,' I said. 'There's KKK on the envelope. Those letters were on Uncle Elias's envelope too.' We were both shaking and afraid. 'Yes, and this time it says, "Put the papers in the garden." Which papers?' 'The papers in Uncle Elias's box. He burnt them,' I said. 'And where does this letter come from?' my father said. He looked at the envelope. 'Dundee, Scotland.' 'Well, I don't know anything about pips or papers. I'm not going to do anything.' 'Father, you must tell the police,' I said. I remembered my uncle's letter from India. I was very worried. 'No, they'll laugh at me. Let's just forget about it,' he replied. 3 days later, my poor father went to visit an old friend who lived some miles away. But he never came back. The police said that he was walking home in the dark when he fell down a hill. He was badly hurt, and he died soon after. They decided it was an accident, but I didn't agree. I thought it was murder. And I could not forget the 5 orange pips and the strange letters to my uncle and my father. But I've tried to forget, and I've lived alone in that house for nearly 3 years now. And yesterday, I got this."
The young man showed us an envelope with KKK on the back and 5 small orange pips.
"You see," he said, "it comes from East London, and it says, 'Put the papers in the garden.' Those are the words that were in the letter to my father."
"So, what did you do next?" asked Holmes.
"Nothing,"
answered Openshaw.
He put his head in his hand.
"I don't know what to do. I'm afraid."
"Nothing?" cried Holmes. "Young man, you must do something fast. You're in danger."
"Well, I've talked to the police,"
said Openshaw unhappily.
"but they laughed at me. They think that there's nothing to worry about."
"How stupid they are!" cried Holmes. "And why didn't you come to me immediately? Your enemies have had almost 2 days to make a plan. Haven't you found anything which will help us?"
"Well, I found this in the locked room,"
said John Openshaw. He showed us a small, half-burnt piece of paper.
"It was with my uncle's papers. It's his writing. Look, it says, March the 7th, 1869, sent the pips to 3 people, Brown, Robinson, and Williams. March the 9th, Brown left. March the 10th, Williams left. March the 12th, visited Robinson and finished business with him."
"Thank you," said Sherlock Holmes. "And now you must hurry home. Put this paper into your uncle's box. Put in a letter which says that your uncle burnt all the other papers. And put the box outside in the garden. I hope your enemies will be happy with that. And then you won't be in danger any more. How are you going home?"
"By train, from Waterloo Station,"
replied Openshaw. "There'll be a lot of people in the streets, so I think that you'll be all right. But be careful."
"Thank you, Mr. Holmes,"
said Openshaw.
"I'll do everything you say."
He went out into the dark night, the wind, and the rain. Chapter 3. K. Sherlock Holmes sat silently and watched the fire. Then he said to me, "John Openshaw is in real danger. Why did his uncle Elias have to leave America? Because he had enemies. When he came back to England, he was afraid. That's why he lived a lonely life and locked all his doors so carefully. Now, where did those letters come from? Did you see?"
"The first from Pondicherry in India, the second from Dundee in Scotland, and the third from East London," I answered.
"Does that tell you anything?" asked Holmes.
"They're all seaports. The writer was on a ship when he wrote the letters," I replied. I was pleased with my answer.
"Very good, Watson," said Holmes. "Somebody sent some pips from India and arrived 7 weeks later to kill Uncle Elias. Then he sent some pips from Scotland and arrived 3 days later to kill John's father. Do you see why I'm worried now? He has sent pips to John from London. John's enemy is in London already."
"Good God, Holmes," I cried. "Who is this man?"
"More than one man, I think. They belong to the Ku Klux Klan. That explains the KKK. Haven't you ever heard of it? It's a very secret group of Americans from the South. They wanted to stop equality for black people and to kill anyone who didn't agree with them. The police couldn't stop them, but in 1869, Uncle Elias, who belonged to this secret group, suddenly left America with all their papers. And so, the group could not go on. Of course, the group wanted to get the papers back. You remember the half-burnt paper? That was Uncle Elias's American diary. While he was working for the KKK, he sent the pips to frighten those 3 men. 2 left the country. but one didn't. So the KKK finished business with him. Or killed him. The KKK always worked like that.
Well, I hope they won't kill young Openshaw, I said.
Chapter 4. The Last Deaths.
But they did. The next morning we read in the newspaper that John Openshaw was dead. A policeman found him in the river near Waterloo Station. The police said it was an accident, but Holmes was very angry about it. He came to me for help, and those men murdered him. I'm going to find them if it's the last thing I do, he said to me, and he hurried out of the house. In the evening, when he came back to Baker Street, he was tired, but pleased. "Watson," he said, "I know the names of Openshaw's enemies, and now I'm going to send them a surprise. This will frighten them." He took 5 pips from an orange and put them in an envelope. On it he wrote, S.H. for J.C. I'm sending the pips not from the KKK, but from me, Sherlock Holmes, to Captain James Cahoon. His ship is called the Star. He and his men are sailing back to Georgia, USA, now. "How did you find him, Holmes?" I asked. "Ship's papers," he said. "I've looked at hundreds of them today. Only one ship, the Star, was in the 3 ports at the right times, and this morning the Star left London to sail back to Georgia. I found out that the captain and 2 of his men, all Americans, weren't on the ship last night. So I'm sure they killed poor John Openshaw. When they arrive in America, they'll get the pips, and then the police will catch them." Sherlock Holmes is a very clever detective, but he can do nothing about the weather. The winter storms at sea that year were worse than ever. And so the Star never arrived in Georgia, and nobody saw the captain or his men again. The murderers of John Openshaw did not get the pips, but in the end, death